1968, a young Jose Alorista would make his way to the Colorado Chicano Youth Liberation Conference with spirit, a new shiny understanding of his indigeneity, and a pocket full of audacity. The poem, respectfully, I don't know if it was a poem or a plan. El Espíritu de Plan de Aztlán would be professed as a contingency of support with an understanding of the traumatic experience in the States. To say most Mexicans, if not all, who migrated here through the passage of the Bracero program or were here already when the borders were rearranged by the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, carry a connection to an indigenous identity would be less than half true. But for the Aztlán Warriors, I need you to listen to your Aztec princess. I know y'all are mostly about aesthetics anyway, so it's easy to start this convo when you look like me, but ending it, not so much. Are you listening? The radicalization of a Mexican does not start in America, and it has its own unique relationship with white supremacy. I bring up Jose Alorista and the Chicano Youth Conference for what seems like the upteenth time, because y'all aren't getting the manufactured identity. And if you follow me on Instagram or Patreon or TikTok, you would know that I keep on saying if you love someone, you owe them honesty. It's just that I think with the combination of mommy issues, trauma induced by the American government, and society mixed with whatever else you got going on, I understand why Chicanos may not take what I have to say as legitimate. But yes, I am tired of the Aztec danzas, the clearly white assuming privilege in everywhere but their own head. I just think that Chicanos need to stop appropriating and commodifying indigenous and Afro-Indigenous culture. I think they need to, do a little bit of work. It's okay. We all need to. And calls coming from inside the house. I'm not better than anybody when I'm speaking about this essay. Actually, there's a real conversation to have around how white supremacy has affected us individually, and even what has become as a result of our relationship with white supremacy. And just, Zionism, yes, and colorism, and all the great things that go into making Mexican nationality. It's a double-edged sword, I guess. So I guess maybe people might think that I'm doing this for attention. How could she have a now almost hour-long series, or an hour and a half long series if this is 30 minutes on something like this? It's just that if you watch my essays, and I'll summarize them for you. In the first essay, I wanted, as in the folks watching this, to understand that if I discredited Chicano's work towards a society that views them as equal, it would be working backwards towards my point in Chicanos having an understanding fundamentally that they are not having the same experience as our indigenous community. I can joke and poke at the idea that we as Mexican Americans took an opportunity when having access to history of Mexican nationhood. What we decided what we wanted from it, and then we made up danzas and festivals and other things that we could commodify. And we even made a mystical homeland to find ourselves with. I know y'all's breathing pattern changes if I say Chicano's rhetoric towards Aztlán is similar with a blue and white rhetoric. But y'all would be upset if I told you that your proximity to whiteness and access to privilege within education and environment, just your privilege in an environment, does not give you an excuse to assume, different marginalized parts. It makes you even more of who you are, and you don't need to change that. You need to accept. And I think this also comes from an aspect of to be properly socialized with all kinds of folks. That you don't live in an isolated thought process, that as a Mexican that we are just like one way, you know? The way you speak, whether it facilitates an accent from Spanish, whether your first language is English or not, does not take your feelings of being a Mexican away. But I want us to also realize, for me, being Mexican is like a lifestyle. Mestizaje, la raza, ni latinidad can be used to box us in a generalize our individual identity. And I'm sorry, but I won't let Chicanos fall into the same trap. If you're a Chicano, you probably have heard, I didn't cross the border crossed us. Here was kind of like one of my first questions kind of going into this essay. What is the percentage of an indigenous Mexican that are migrating to the United States currently and in various times throughout history? And how many are American-made Mexicans, aka the indigenous folk who consider themselves of Mexican ancestry, that are from the United States tribes or pueblos, because, you know, those were colonized by New Spain, and that's how I'm understanding it. Again, I would love to have y'all add on, or give me resources, because I'm not an end all to be all. I'm just trying to figure this out, just like you. And I referenced the people from communities like within New Mexico and Arizona, because whenever there is that conversation with the Chicano, I find about someone's proximity to indigeneity, they give an example of these communities. And again, what is the percentage of that person? What is the percentage of the person that is indigenous, that is migrating there? And I say an indigenous Mexican in the sense of their state where they're migrating from. When I say percentage, I'm only thinking about the amount of people within the dysphoria that identify as a Chicano but facilitate these different connections to their indigeneity. And truthfully, because this all feels like a social construct and it feels Olympic worthy for the mental gymnastics to understand that there's a fundamental difference between these two identities makeups, I can only politely ask these questions to the Chicanos in the room to show y'all that it doesn't make sense to me. My bias is people that are indigenous don't identify as a Chicano, or they rarely do, and the people that you keep on saying do, i.e. these categories I'm bringing up, I don't think they do either. Is that just like I would be American, but not in any way to be disrespectful. And again, I think also, to me, this person, these are like three different people, if I could put something up here, all different from a stereotypical California Chicano definition, because their proximity to their pueblo or indigenous community can vastly vary. Something I learned in the Machismo, the Performance Mexican Men Are Born Into essay, was that in colonial New Spain, mestizo children would be given up for adoption at large and put into friaries with Jesuits. I butchered that in a short video that I made on my TikTok. These Jesuits would give them to wet nurses to be nursed, and then eventually these babies would be placed into foster homes. And I don't know if I want to assume this, but I'm going to, based off of how colorism works and La Casta paintings were, that depending on their proximity to whiteness, they would either have an endearing relationship with the family and be put into apprenticeships, and be revered as a aspect of lineage, or most likely, throughout different colonial New Spain, indigenous and Spanish families, they would adopt young boys for earning power to, bring income into the household. Now, and to kind of raise them up to bring income into the household. And I mean, if we think of how the Mexican identity is propagandized to us to believe that we are also just indigenous and Mexican, when that's not the case. It kind of, again, isolates us from any other reality that would help understand our true individual identities. I think if you understand your individual identity as a Mexican and even as a Mexican American, you would probably have more discontentment with ideologies that would align with white supremacy. But it is my hypothesis, and I would love for us to expand on this again. Not saying that this is correct, but this is a thought, that if you do not unpack the ways that as a mestizo you have been affected by white supremacy, and even a Mexican American have you been affected by the American government, you will continue to regurgitate rhetoric in a line to, awful things.
How do we realign our thinking to understand that our role as Chicanos is to advance the betterment of humankind, but specifically of Chicanos? So if either of you'd like...
When discovering my feelings about how, the Chicano came off in conversations in political spaces, like Chicano Zionism rang true for me, in parallel with how I felt Chicanos were coming off. So my first questions were, what were parallels to you found in Chicanos' rhetorics and Zionists?
Unfortunately, I have to shout out Decolonized Buffalo, Rick, who did a lot of great work in terms of exposing the pitfalls within Chicano nationalism and how it is essentially anti-indigenous, even as they try to pretend to reconnect. And I do say pretend because fundamentally we are bastards of colonization. We're never going to be able to know what our original language, who our original people were. We have these broad assumptions, and that's about it. Anything more than that, and you're cosplaying, you're doing pretend Indian. So he did a lot of great work on that. Unfortunately, he has a tendency to disappear, and he takes his ball with him, meaning he takes his work with him, which I think is a very cowardly thing. This time he disappeared after he smeared me. So it's a habit of his, but I generally do not care who you are and what you do. If your work is valuable, I have to shout you out, even if it's begrudgingly, like I just have to. That being said, the similarities is something that he helped me see a lot more, but something I was already on the path on, considering that some of the biggest figure within the Chicano movement is who? Cesar Chavez. Unquestionably. It's not Corky, it's nobody else, it's Cesar Chavez. He is a nationalist in the sense of he was calling Border Patrol, and I'm sure he would have called ICE if they were around, on undocumented farm workers, sure, because they were scabs, well, they were being brought in by corporations, and this is why we have to have a internationalist approach to our politics. The moment that you lock in on your national interests, not as a people, but as a country like that, you're bound to be put against foreign workers, and that's what breeds xenophobia. So specifically, the parallels would be the labor Zionist approach to the colonization of Palestine. Specifically, they really saw themselves as the indigenous people of that region, and they really saw it as, if we work the land, that land is ours. You add the extra layer of spiritual Zionism, which is like, hey, sure, we weren't born there, but spiritually, our ancestors that were also Jewish are from that region. So we have a claim to it. And you see that with, Chicanismo in the caucus, the 1969 Chicago Youth Conference, where we first really see this call for Aztlán, right, through the poem. And there's been some debate about, Aztlán wasn't an actual physical place. It was a spiritual state of mind. Very, very 60s, very psychedelic. It's cute, but unfortunately, we've seen it with Zionism that even when you try to say, spiritually, it's a spiritual connection, it's going to lead you to the same path of saying blood and soil. It's going to lead you to the same path of saying, hey, the land is ours, it was promised to us 3,000 years ago. And you see some of the same dismissal, if not outright antagonism, against the indigenous population of that region. Aztlán occupies, or the concept of Aztlán materially is the land that Mexico or New Spain lost during the Mexican-American War. But that land, going back to New Spain, was colonized. And you have the whole wars with the Indio Bravos, right? The unruly, the brave, the rowdy indigenous people that were unwilling to be colonized. And so you had a push by New Spain and the early Mexican government to send out mestizos, poor working class peasants, out into these barren lands. They weren't barren. They weren't being used in the way that Europeans were using them. But again, the parallels with Zionism in the sense of, what does Zionists say? A people without a land for a land without a people, or some BS like that. Again, the barrenness. But that's because Europeans don't understand how indigenous people, work their lands and how they coexist with their lands. But we were pushed out there, and I do say we because most of us are mestizos. And it might be uncomfortable for us. I prefer bastards of colonization because we don't know who we belong to. There's nobody here to claim us. A lot of us would not exist without colonization, right? So with that in mind, this whole idea that we're like a pure raza, right? The idea that we're a cosmic race, the idea that we're somehow elevated because of colonization, I think is disgusting, eugenics and supremacist through and through. But it's all interconnected with Aztlán, because fundamentally what Aztlán does, it erases, even if you want to include the Deni, the Hopi, the Apache, the Yaqui, all these indigenous groups of that region. It's not like we were communicating with them or in communication or in community with them to be like, hey, this is our idea, this is our proposal, what do y'all think? Because you are the people of this land, right? It wasn't that. It was a declaration of, this is ours. We're here to reclaim it. It's a national movement, but it's a national movement, not just of bastards of colonization, but people new to that region, right? Chicanos occupy this unique space where a Chicano, we're a community, if you want to call it that is going to forever grow, because immigration is what creates a Chicano, right? So it's this weird concept that makes no sense, but the parallels of Zionism really lie in the fact that you are a group of people claiming a land that is not yours, was never yours. In this whole myth of like, no, we came from the north. All right, how far north do you want to go? Do we want to talk about the Bering Strait Bridge? Is that how long we're going to go? Like, okay, is Russia Aztlán also? Like, what are we doing? Like, this is Eurasia? Is truly Aztlán? It's ridiculous. But I'm sympathetic to it because it is a desire to have an identity, to have a people, to have a home. We were robbed of that, and it's heartbreaking, and it's something that fuels my solidarity with Palestinians, with other colonized people, Puerto Ricanos, Hawaiians, Polynesians. It fuels me because I'm like, I don't want you to lose what we lost. But reclaiming it, aka taking land that isn't ours, isn't going to fix that. It's going to turn us into what is, European Jews have become. Colonizers, for the purpose of what? Buying into whiteness, for the purpose of what? Laying claim to land that isn't yours? Like, you think that's going to elevate you? You think that's going to put you on equal footing? All those Europeans are still anti-Semitic as hell. It doesn't matter, how much land European Jews take on their behalf, right? Because don't believe any of this Zog anti-Semitic shit that they run the U.S. government. Never, bro. There's a hierarchy of power. So with that in mind, when I look at Cesar Chavez, when I look where the movement has been led astray with the endorsement of Hillary Clinton and people that have no vested interest in our communities, it terrifies me to understand that. I mean, look at Border Patrol, look at ICE. We make up a lot of that space, and they need us to speak the language to rat each other out. Yeah. It leads you to a path of saying, hey, we want this, we want to become colonizers, but we're covering it up in this desperation for an identity. We lost it. And the best thing that we can do, and the closest we can get closer to it, is by being, in solidarity with indigenous people. That's the closest we're going to get to it, and that's the best we can do. And I don't think that's something to take lightly or to take for granted. I think that's something that we need to embrace and say, hey, we are the outcome, the result of genocide, of colonization, of ethnic cleansing, and we refuse to perpetrate that. We refuse to align ourselves with it. We rather align with the relatives that we still have, distant as they may be, instead of trying to always be in the forefront of things. It's very hard for us to say, hey, it's not about us.
Yeah.
But if you look at every indigenous community, they're leading the way into protecting the ecosystem, whether it's a rainforest or just, wetlands, what have you. That's what they prioritize because they understand that there's a bigger picture. Why can't we do the same? Why do we need to impose our own nation state? It's pretty childish. It's retrograde, and we need to move past it and be critical of the way that Chicanismo speaks over and replaces and erases, silences indigenous people and population, even if they're no longer here, especially in, California, even if they're no longer here. So the parallels are consistent, and you kind of have to study Zionism in order to really see, what is what.
I feel like the next question I was going to ask you was, what does Chicano Zionism mean to you? You did summarize, but I would just want to ask you if you had anything to add to that question or anything you wanted to say to that.
All right. Not to get too poetic, but the whole Aztlán thing kind of did start through a poem. So
It's it.
Chicano nationalism to me is a desperate cry for something that we lost collectively. Casi un berrinche towards the universe and towards reality, towards our history. And a want to stand alongside indigenous people, like groups like AIM, to stand alongside New Africans, like the Black Panthers, to stand side by side by them and say, oh, we're also a national group. We're also people. Well, that's not the case. It's a little different. I guess we're people in terms of bastards of colonization, but, you can have the most, green-eyed güero who can be, the Miklos is a Chicano. Just as like those of us that still have, indigenous phenotypes who are more susceptible to claiming indigeneity. Mm-hmm. There's just really no sense to it. And when I mentioned that the Chicano, to be a Chicano really is to be diaspora. That's all it is. Right? Because a Chicano and a Pocho is essentially the same thing. It just depends how well-spoken you are in Spanish, how, informed you are. Yeah, it's a political label, but a political label in terms of what? Do I agree with Cesar Chavez? Barely. And I'm a union organizer. And I push for an internationalist, perspective. He didn't. And there's countless examples of, like, a lot of these individuals ended up being absorbed into the system of liberal politics. What does that say about your ideology? What does that say about your movement? Right? We don't have the same figures. We don't have the Ashara course. We just don't. We don't have the Mumias. We don't. Why is that? I don't have the answers to that. I really did move away from a lot of that Chicano identity or movement pursuit. I remember being in Mecha when the whole name change was happening, and there's threats and online harassment. Mind you, I always say I was affiliated with Mecha. I was never an official member. I helped them with their organizing, I helped them with their events. I was never an official member because I didn't agree with their politics, but I agreed with the people in the room. And I think that's a parallel to what it means to be labeled a Chicano. Like, if somebody calls me Chicano, I'm not upset. If somebody labels me a Pocho, I don't care. Like, it's nonsense to me. I'm moving away from that type of identity politics. But I do think that a lot of it is a spiritual thing. And as a bad atheist, because I'm a bad atheist, that need to want to reconnect, I think there's a spiritualness to it. And that's why you see the spiritual aspect of glorifying La Virgen de Guadalupe, but at the same time, like wanting to make sure that you're still connected with the indigenous deities whose names we could barely pronounce. And who we don't even know if like our ancestors were actually worshiping. If they were worshiping against them, or if they were, not affiliated with it. We don't know the history.
Right.
at all. And we're pretending to. And I think that is so disrespectful to our ancestors and our, again, desperation. I think is the key word, desperation of needing some form of an identity, because it makes it uncomfortable to be like, hey, we're the results of colonization, and that's not nice to hear. But then you see the history of the mestizo aligning with the Spaniards and turning their back against the indigenous people, and then now suddenly you want to be like, no, I'm indigenous, a tu conveniencia.
Pero también queremos decirle al mundo, porque sabemos, pues, conocemos que tenemos un enemigo común, que es el neoliberalismo. Ese, pues, por eso todos los hombres y mujeres del mundo que tienen, pues, o sea, tienen la voluntad de luchar.
The degree of culture to which a nation has attained may be estimated from 2 points of view: from that of the culture which it has produced, and from that of the state of its cultural life at any given time. In other words, culture in quotation has both an objective and an subjective meaning. Objectively, a nation's culture is something which has a reality of its own. It is the concrete expression of the best minds of the nation in every period of its existence. The nation expresses itself in certain definitive forms which remain for all time and are no longer dependent on those who created them any more than a fallen apple is dependent on the tree from which it fell. Culture in the objective sense and culture in the subjective sense do not necessarily reach the same degree of development at the same time. There are periods in the history of a nation in which all of its spiritual strength is concentrated in a few exceptional gifted minds, and these produce an original culture of high value, which the generality of their countrymen, such is their state of culture and quotations at that particular time, cannot fully understand. On the other hand, the intellectual forces of a nation in a particular period may find their expression in the general state of a culture. Education may be universal and the tone of life throughout enlightened and redefined, while at the same time this culture may be barren, producing no masterminds able to express the spirit of the nation in original creative work, but dependent entirely on its own past, on a borrowing from nations. In detailing therefore with the questions of spreading culture among the Jewish people, we must remember that there are two terms involved. On the one hand, the culture in the objective sense which we wish to spread. On the other hand, the relation to that culture. Our task thus fallen into two halves. We have in the first place to perfect the body of culture which the Jewish people have created in the past and to simulate the creative power to fresh expression, and in second place to raise the cultural level of the people in general, and to make its objective culture the subjective possession of each of its own individual members. And in order to discover what we ought to do and what we can do in each of these different directions, we must clearly understand the position and needs both of the culture and of the people. Now, what does that sound like to you?
Coming in by the hundred, by the thousands, our people are not only in some of the crews where there's now strike breaking. Some of those crews are 100% illegals, outright, openly, with no attempt to disguise it. And so it's so bad now that we estimate 60 to 70% of the farm workers in California, of the resident worker, of the citizen, is out of a job because of the wetbacks. They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable. See, they're coming in with the consent of the Immigration Service, which is part of the Department of Justice. How else could they come? We, for instance, know that if you go to Coachella, you go to around the El Paso area, the secondary immigration checkpoints have been unmanned now for at least 3-4 weeks.
In 1968, the Chicano movement was yearning for cohesive state structures. a unification of the most populated Mexican American areas that were fighting for the rights to survive in the Anglo-Saxon American system, allowed for the Conference of Santa Barbara that would be held as an important place in the timeline for the Chicano movement. This conference brought together some of the most recognized faces and behind the scene community that made the movement's wheels turn. When we think of the Chicano movement or what it means to identify as a Chicano, it seems almost every Mexican American has their own response. It's understood society, being a Chicano means a bloodline that facilitates indigenous and white and then sometimes Afro-Mexican heritage that is a result of colonial Mexico's history. And then alongside the reality of either people's parents or grandparents migrating to the States, which has in turn made us consume American culture and internalize it. But depending on how we are presenting in Chicano culture as a person who either likes lowrider aesthetic or has a ranchero vibe or is a Latino, we have a similar undertone with a specific geographical component. So the Conference of Santa Barbara facilitated conversation about what it would mean to maintain a cultural sovereignty towards the Chicano idea and how others should carry themselves within this militancy. But what was so important about the Mexican identity that were being discussed? Well, of course, language accommodation in schools were the start of, I think, anyone's thought process or mainstream conversation when speaking to Mexican Americans' rights or Mexicans' rights in America. But that was one of the huge components to this conference. Years before, we saw the Salvatierra versus Del Rio and the Brown versus Westminster cases that both highlighted the importance of the Mexican children's integration in the American system with fairness and not lack of resources. So, this was something that was being fought for. Some children were treated as cattle to work for the white and privilege, and some children got to build their own reality based off of their own hard work and merit, according to the whites. So at the conference, this was kind of understood that there was a pipeline of acceptability amongst the American society. But Chicanos, at least the ones who had the financial support to fight the cases, also held prejudice ingrained into their own culture, right? A carefully crafted right American Mexican pipeline was in the making, and I'm just thinking about from the 1920s to the 1970s, and we're talking generally. Again, watch the 2 other videos if you're interested. Was in the makings, and we see the results of the children who fought in the federal army, the children of those people who fought in the federal army in Mexico, and even those grandchildren gain access to policy through connection for either funding or they would lobby with their own communities. But also some of the centralists that could maintain the wallet during the time that we're speaking of the Mexican American Revolution, and also then the Bracero program era shortly after. And some of the liberals who immigrated were able to find success in the American society due to their lack of pigment. And I mean, that's kind of the case in Mexico as well. Your proximity to whiteness was going to be able to, tell you how your quality of life was going to be.